collected some questions from conference participants and from conference organizers and volunteers who are also conference participants. We're going to have the starter questions on slides, but then we'll see where the discussion takes us. And we do have some very amazing people here who have lots of experience in the industry, and we're going to ask them to share the experience and also try to predict the future.
No pressure.
No pressure. It's like horoscopes. It always works. So to kick it off, let's just start with introductions. So would you please introduce yourselves?
Me first? Sure. My name is Caleb. I'm a co-founder and CEO at Sensu. Sensu is a highly scalable multi-cloud monitoring platform. We're somewhere over 500,000 nodes under management, and we think a lot about automation. We come from a background, most of us at Sensu, building CI/CD pipelines and just in general automating all the things. I am a big fan of what I think of as these kinds of technical conferences that are kind of by the doers and for the doers. I've co-founded a conference maybe some of you went to a few years ago called Atomicon. We did a couple times, and so just a big fan of these kinds of discussions. So happy to be here.
So that's who stole that name.
I'm Nicole Forsgren. I do research and strategy at Google Cloud via the Dora acquisition. If anyone's familiar with the State of DevOps reports or the book Accelerate, I've been playing in that kind of data and research world, kind of looking into the capabilities and practices that drive good outcomes at the, God, I'm going to sound like an academic, individual team and organizational level. So I like to kind of hang out with, as Caleb said, like the doers, right? So I was a developer and a sysadmin for a long time, and I got into research because I was sick of my management saying, yeah, cool story, that'll never work here. And so I wanted to win those fights with data. So sometimes I like hang out at the, with doers, because I like doing the tech stuff, and I want to find out what like good problems and good solutions are, but I can also speak executive because at some point we got to sell that, right? We got to sell those solutions. So yeah, that's me.
Hi, I'm Brooke Treadgold. I am from New Zealand and I work for a company called ANZ Bank. I don't come from a traditional technology background, so I started my career in internal audit and risk management. And so my role now is to work with teams within our organisation to enable them to sustainably implement organisational change around how they deliver customer value and how they work. And a lot of that involves translation between technical teams and the leadership team or the business, and making sure everybody's on the same page.
And I am Rebecca Parsons. I'm the Chief Technology Officer for ThoughtWorks. I had the great fun to actually work on a project with Dave Farley when he used to work for us. Jez and I never worked together, but we certainly worked alongside each other for a long time. A lot of my role is, much like Brooke just said, trying to explain to people who are in positions of technical authority why they need to think about what they're doing differently, and translate that into words that they can understand from the words that we like to toss around. But I also see, I see a broader problem in our industry where I don't think many people who use the phrase continuous delivery actually understand what it means and what it encompasses. For example, I was at a conference and they had sponsored a team competition amongst various organizations there. And when they were asked to tell their continuous delivery story, every single one of the teams proudly proclaimed what their automated test coverage was. And that was their success in continuous delivery. And so I think we all should have a mission of helping people understand what continuous delivery is really all about.
So I think that is a natural segue into the next question. So I know we're at a continuous delivery conference, and we kind of assume that maybe you read the book and maybe you heard about continuous delivery, but there's always a lot of confusion and words are hard. So I like definitions. So let's make sure we're on the same page and maybe try to define what continuous delivery means to you as a thought leader on this panel.
Words have power and definitions matter. I have strong feels. I'm gonna let you all go because.
Oh, no. I was going to say, I want you to start. We need the academic definition first, right?
So, like, the joke is I have, like, two hats, right? Like, part of me is, like, the real person hat, and part of me is, like, the pedantic academic jerk hat. So the joke as an academic, although this is very real, is that, so, like, as an academic, what you do that matters, in strong finger quotes, is you write and publish research. And so the joke is that in order to get something published, you have to define it, because once you've defined it, reviewer number 2, who's the a-hole, always, reviewer number 2 is the worst. You can Google this, it's everywhere. Reviewer number 2 can't fight with you, because once you've defined it, you defined it, right? So within my paper, and until something is like universally understood. So my biggest problem, and then I'll get to my answer, I'm sorry, also another academic problem. Like my biggest challenge and my biggest problem whenever I go into companies is someone in a suit has redefined something so that they can get their gold star and their big fat bonus check. So like, we're gonna do CI, and someone on the board is like, dope, as soon as you get CI, or as soon as you go to the cloud, because they read it in HBR, which is manager crack, like, that's important. And so the executive's like, yeah, cloud, and then they set out this like audacious goal, and then they realize they aren't gonna hit it, so they drastically limit scope and redefine it, and then you hit, right, to your point, of like redefining CD to be something that is a very important and yet drastically smaller subcomponent. So then you walk into whatever company and it's something that's totally different. So I've been to companies that are like, we do CI. And then like, so Dora had an assessment and we would come in and we'd be like, oh, CI is your algorithmically identified constraint. And they're like, but we're doing CI. We hit that last year. And like, but you're not doing CI in ways that, according to our research, and yes, I defined it to do the thing, but we defined it in ways that were statistically identified to be predictive of performance outcomes. That's a whole lot of words. Like, we took a bunch of measures, we referenced prior literature, we checked to see if these subcomponents that you can use as an evaluative tool lumped together, and if they were predictive of outcomes. So like, we've done a bunch of stuff to like make sure it's right, and if it makes you better. And then, because very legitimate business reasons, because we gotta like keep jobs, people redefine that scope to cut it in half. I didn't answer your question of what CD is, but like, that's my definition rant. I'll let y'all answer the rest. Or like hashtag, so like in part I think that CD, depending on how you define it, so like Dave, I'm gonna slightly disagree with you, or agree with you, right? So Dave and Jez's keynote yesterday had a definition of CD that was very encompassing in terms of software, I'm gonna use my words, software development and delivery with, I think I'm gonna say speed and stability that delivers value for an entire organization. Did everyone see that, where it was like CD and it was like a big circle that like encompassed a whole lot of stuff? Under my research definition for the last 6 years, I would call that DevOps. For a whole bunch of other organizations, they call this modernization or they call it transformation. Honestly, do like a find and replace and whatever's gonna get you money in your organization, right? Using their book, I've like used a definition of continuous delivery that's been like very specific, but and smaller pieces of that, but honestly, like whatever you want to do is fine.
You said you did what you were complaining about.
So wait, so I'm saying I did. Oh no, so I used a definition of continuous delivery. So CI for me is very specifically things where when you commit code, it results in checking in tests or kicking off automated build, kicking off automated tests. I'm gonna have to remember this off the top of my head.
This is a test.
I know. There's like 35 capabilities. I didn't know there was gonna be a test on this. Prioritizing the build, although that's also, it's cross-loaded with CD depending on the year, so that's why I'm like, this is okay. And just help me out.
I've got it if you want it.
So prioritizing green, and there's one more. But like there's 4 things that are specifically CI, right? And then CD is like another 3 or 4 things. So like they're a very, very specific thing. So like I think under my definition, right, DevOps is the technical capabilities, the process capabilities, the cultural capabilities, right? So that's what I say DevOps is. So some other people say, so Dave Farley said that's what he calls CD. Some other people call it transformation. Some other people call it modernization.
So words are definitely hard. Rebecca,
Sorry.
do you want to also pitch in?
I have a much more practical definition. But what I focus on is the path. And that continuous delivery means that you can, not that you have to, but that you can check in code and have nobody touch it and have everything work and get you into production. So it's to me, it's that path. And what surprised me when I first started using that definition, I left off the "but you don't have to" part. And the number of people who came up and said, "Well, I don't want that to happen." And I said, "Well, go read the book. There is nothing in that book that says you can't have a big green button on somebody's desk and nothing goes live until he smacks the button. There's nothing in the book that says that manual intervention can't happen. The point is that it doesn't have to happen." And that's the part that I try to push on. But that means everything has to be on that path. And this is where I think a lot of people start to go wrong with that kind of definition, because it's, well, but it's okay if I don't do this, or it's okay. It's still continuous delivery because I have automated tests, but I still have to deploy manually and all of those kinds of things. And that I think is part of the misconception. The other misconception that I very often see are people who think, well, continuous delivery can only happen in a nice modern microservices architecture world where everything's pretty. And it's like, no. Yeah. Actually, where it matters most is in the messy, crusty stuff. And if you just focus on the easy stuff, you're not going to actually get the value out of it.
So I want to kind of segue from that too into the next question. So we mentioned it yesterday. When the book first came out, a lot of people called it madness. And I still walk into a lot of organizations where people tell me it's completely impossible. It will never work here, or this is really scary. We don't want our code in production every time someone makes a change because there's a confusion about what CD really is. And so despite all that, I think this is the de facto standard, at least what people trying to achieve in their organizations right now, or at least what they put the label on, like we're doing CD or we're doing DevOps or we're doing this and that, even if it's not really that. So why do you think that was? Why do you think that was such a big rise in popularity so quickly?
Well, first of all, thank you for bailing us out from having to follow those tough acts on the definition front. And moving on to the popularity contest question will be a much easier one for me to approach. I think it rose in popularity because it works. Things are popular because they resonate with people. I think it works because it creates a certain kind of safety, and we can't go fast without things being safe. You can look at any field of human accomplishment, and the very early explorers did something that was unsafe and they got pretty far, but for the rest of us to go where they went, we have to create some kind of safety. And so for me, the key words around CI and CD are all about speed, and we achieve speed through safety. And I think recently I heard someone say, giving a talk about what it means to be some kind of lead or in a leadership position, whether if it's a management position or an IC, that being a lead or being some person of authority or senior person in organizations that are trying to achieve these goals is all about making it safe. And so I have a very simple answer to the question, but one that I think, and it's also, the last thing I'll say on that is, it became popular, I think, because, as I mentioned in the beginning, it works, and kind of once you've seen it, you can never unsee it. It's one of those kind of like first one's free sort of things. It's not really free, but once you get there, you never want to go back.
Yeah, I agree with Caleb. But I think also, I'm not sure anybody actually likes the alternative of 3 months of development, 6 weeks of regression. It's painful as hell. And actually, when you start to decompose what continuous delivery is that it actually resonates with people outside of technology, from the gatekeepers, so change management, internal audit, risk management. When they actually start to understand it, they actually really like it because it's a lot more transparent than it was when you bundled months and months of code, and then actually these testing outcome reports, when you read them, you're like, what did you actually change? And it's so hard to actually read that it actually doesn't give you any confidence, but continuous delivery starts to give you that confidence once you can actually articulate it simply to people outside of technology.
I just want to add one thing. Continuous delivery is one of those things that it's hard to get it absolutely, completely 100% right. But you don't have to get it absolutely 100% right to start to get value. And taking even simple steps, you can start to see value, and that's how you convince managers to spend money, is you say, see, I did just this little thing, and look what happened. Isn't this wonderful? Now, if you give me this time or this money or this license or whatever, then I can do this much more. But every little step gives you some kind of value, an increase in safety or a decrease in risk or visibility, and that's how things catch on. You don't have to do the whole thing to see value. It takes much longer if you have to wait until the end of the transformation before you can see any value.
And to the point about, there was such pushback before because it could only work in certain environments. We've seen this work on firmware, right? Like, it absolutely works on mainframes. And to your point, right, small incremental improvements deliver value and transparency and auditability early, right? And I think that's been another piece that, to Caleb's point, like, once you see it, you can't unsee it, right? We're the best drug dealers, right? Like, once you get that taste, it's really hard to go back.
So the next question is, the future is here, but it's not evenly distributed. So what is perhaps the biggest barrier that organizations face, or what's the thing they need to get on that drug and start using it and get there?
I'll start. I think the thing I see is actually having a really clear idea of what you're trying to achieve. When you ask a team what they're trying to do and they just say continuous delivery, and you ask why, that's a surefire way that some executive's going to deprioritize it, and it's going to become a hobby on the side of the desk. So I think it's really being clear on what it is that it's going to give to you and your business, and therefore why it should be a priority.
One of the things we also see is, and this is fortunately getting better, but there's so many products out there that are so difficult to automate the deployment of. People think, isn't it wonderful that I have this pretty little wizard that I can, drag things around, and, isn't that fantastic? And it's like, that might be fantastic, but at 3 o'clock on a Sunday morning, I'm not going to be caring about how pretty the little thing is. I want to be able to script it. And there is still a lot, particularly in the legacy environment of these packages and systems, where you just can't, without being really persistent, automate some of those things. And so organizations do have to prioritize continuous delivery as one of those things on the package evaluation form to say, yes, this is important. And no, I'm not going to buy your product. I'm going to buy this one because I can't automate the deployment of this one and I can the other one. And so that's a very concrete thing, in addition to, as she said, knowing why you're doing it.
I'll preface my comment on this question by saying when you give enough presentations or sit in enough panels, you will inevitably reference an expert in the space and say that they, quote unquote, wrote the book on such and such topic, even if no such book was published. I'm in a very strange situation here because many books have been published and Nicole literally wrote them. So most of the smart things I might accidentally say probably came from one of those books. One of them is that I think there has to be some appreciation for the organizational and technical improvements that have to be made. It's not just a technical challenge. I think scope, that was a really important starting point, is understanding what it is that we're trying to accomplish. And then, yeah, I'm at a loss for what else I could potentially add.
So I'm actually going to segue from this into the next question. So what are the metrics that you find useful to evaluate? Exactly. Actually measuring. So, you know, measuring what you measure, what gets measured gets managed. So what do you see as useful to kind of prove these gradual successes and help sell this to executives and show value to your organization?
Well, there is this report that has this discussion of 4 key metrics, I believe it is. Let's see if I pass the test. Number of deployments, or rate of deployment, percentage of failures, mean time to recovery, and lead time to get new functionality.
Not because the answer was accurate and you're brave.
But I think when you're starting out, those metrics do seem really scary to people.
Oh, they're terrifying.
Yeah, how am I going to measure this, or how am I going to measure that? And so I think trying to find something very specific in scope. Okay, it currently takes me X period of time to do this task, whatever it is. And I want to reduce, I'm going to take that period of time and invest it into changing that time into something short. There was a client I worked with several years ago. It used to take 3 months from the time that all of the in-house testing was done before they could deploy. And so they said, we're going to set ourselves a goal that in 3 months' time, we can automate this process so that it happens in under 30 minutes. And when they did their next quarterly update, he started a screen running in the background that was showing the deployment. And in about 18 and a half minutes, while he was speaking and talking about what they had done a deployment, run all of the regression, everything. But they said, I'm just going to start right there. And when you are in the position of starting from the mess that many enterprises are in, I think that's what's most important. Yes, eventually you want to get to where you're measuring those 4 key metrics, but start with something very concrete and very simple that everybody understands.
So measure where you are today and then have a proof that you've improved.
Start with a baseline, and if it's like awful, embrace the awful. And if you've been faking it forever, just say like, we're gonna just wash it. Embrace the bad, because then you can only go up, right? Like, it's fine, right? And And even if you have to hunch it, right? Like you made a really good point. It can be really hard to do those 4 metrics because it's so hard to measure them. And some people are like, well, we don't have all our systems in place. How do I actually correlate all these metrics to capture lead time? It covers so many systems. Ask someone. It's not going to be precise. It doesn't matter. Do you deploy daily? Do you deploy monthly? Do you deploy once a year? Honestly, that's good enough. If you currently deploy yearly and you move to quarterly,
It's a win.
that's a solid win. You know you improved. Now, if you want to know if you deploy once a minute versus once every 15 seconds, a person is not really going to be able to tell you that, and that's a fantastic problem to have. Like, handle that differently, right? And to Rebecca's point, right? If you know that you want to fix your 4 key metrics, figure out your biggest problem, and at that point, again, you can probably hunch it. You can say, testing is killing us. Source control is a major problem. And then pick that, set that goal, focus for the next quarter or 6 months, right? If it's architecture or trunk-based development, that's probably going to take a little bit longer, especially if you're in a legacy system. But that doesn't mean it can't be done. Focus there. And if you have 50 initiatives, I award you 0 points. May God have mercy on your soul. Pick like 3 or 4, right? And that's all you need. And that's how you're going to accelerate. And like, that's your jam.
So segueing again. So cultural transformations are a huge part of this, right? And you just mentioned initiatives, and there's lots of initiatives going on, and you have to sell it to people that this is important. And the biggest challenge really isn't technology. It's, I can sell you DevOps, but you can't really buy it from me. So exactly. So what's the best way to lead that organizational transformation in your company? I know Brooke was leading.
I don't think there's one best way to lead a transformation. I think it depends on the variables at play within your organization and what you're trying to achieve. What I would say, though, is one of the best ways I've seen it done is, I guess, events changing culture. So it's really hard when you just talk about culture and be like, we should change the culture. And it just becomes this talk fest. And when you go, okay, well, what are we practically going to do? It just becomes this loop of talking. Whereas actually, if you focus on, this is what we're trying to achieve, and a practical goal, irrespective of how small, and actually showing people within your organization that it can be possible, you start to change people's, I guess, attitudes around what is possible. And I think one other thing on this is culture, or organizational culture, by itself is really hard to change. It's the collective beliefs and values of everybody. So if you have 1,000 people in your organization and they've been thinking the same way for 20 years, you're not going to change that overnight. And so I think it's around the expectations of what it means for an organization to change, and actually small things over time are the things that contribute to those successful transformations.
I'm going to just reuse my disclaimer for every question, I think, for the rest of this discussion. Again, because the people I'm on the stage with here. I heard an interesting quote, though, a couple years back from a CIO at Cisco, speaking in the context of just automation in general. And the quote was something like, I need an automation strategy I can rally people around and deliver against. And I found this to be like a very simple recipe for how to think about questions that include the word, organizational and transformation, in that the best ideas, if they're too complex or too hard to believe, you're not going to get people to support you, and you need the support of the people in order to turn these massive ships. And so I'm the champion for keeping things simple, so the strategy has to be simple enough for people to understand and believable enough that we can have the collective courage or belief that we can execute against a strategy.
And a couple of things that we've found that works really well. First, don't say. Don't talk about the transformation. Start doing something differently, because then it becomes more real for people. And if you start getting some success, people will actually come to you and say, "I want part of that," because they see people smiling. They see good things happening, and we all want to be better. And so when we see something good happening, it's like, how do I get a part of that? Another part of many transformations is changing the silos within an organization. And sometimes something very simple like inviting two groups who are warring with each other to the same lunch. And all of a sudden, it's not, oh, those people over there. It's a human being. And it is amazing. We seem to forget sometimes that sometimes it's just, I need to know that this person is a human being, and it's no longer this abstract concept of this evil, idiotic person who is trying to make my life miserable. Well, no, he's worrying about different kinds of things. And so we talk about a lot of strategies for things like that, but sometimes just getting people in the same room and saying, here's our problem, can we solve this together?
And there are a few things that we've seen that work, or at least that help, right? So, and a bunch of this has come up in actually like my other research. You have to take both a tops down and a bottoms up approach. So in terms of top down, and like we see this, and personally, I snark about it. In terms of tops down, you have to have very strong consistency of message, right? To kind of plus one what Caleb just said, it needs to be simple, but it has to be memorable. So that's why sometimes from management, you hear like the same message over and over and over again, and you're like, yeah, I know, you say these two sentences at the beginning of every single meeting. But we do find that actually helps reinforce that this is real, but it also needs to be authentic, right? Like, don't say it and then do something totally different. In terms of bottoms up, there are a couple things. One is, like Rebecca said, change what you do, but there also has to be some type of enthusiasm, right? So in companies that I've worked with, when they are doing this big transformation, nod or smile or just like snark with me when everyone's like, this is amazing, and everyone wants to be on like the cloud native team, and then the legacy team is like, I just got boned, right? Like, this is not fun. No, you can change this message in ways that are not insincere. Follow me. If you're on the legacy team and you're doing a transformation, you are doing the dopest stuff on the planet, because this is hard, this is challenging. You're not doing something that the rest of the world is doing. You're solving the hardest, most interesting problems, and when you do this, guess what? You're going to keynote every freaking conference on the planet. Suddenly, everyone is clamoring and fighting to be on that team. Oh, except that is now the hardest team to get on, because you don't have 15 years of experience in mainframe, which, by the way, doesn't even make you an expert. It makes you intermediate level. Let alone figuring out how to transform it. And now you're doing things differently, which backs up the research by John Shook. To change culture, you do things differently. You don't just talk about it. Now you've got top down saying we're doing things differently, which drives value, which changes the way we do things, which is a little bit of a broken record, but it's exciting. And now you've got this grassroots where, yeah, cloud native's cool, but we're cooler, right? And you've got this excitement in the whole org. And you pull the teams together where they can swap stories about what's working and what's not and what's breaking. And some things are going to be breaking similarly, but some things are going to be breaking differently. And what's similar and what's different among our legacy and our cloud native apps. And what languages are just broken because technology sucks.
And I
like,
heard
how
you
cool
can
was
even.
that?
I heard you can even CI/CD a VAX. Huh? And Kat. Now, I have a question for the audience, and Nicole kind of stole a little bit of my thunder, but who here considers themselves an individual contributor? Okay, most of the audience. Okay, and some kind of management leadership position, something? Okay, some of the same people
Who gets
raised
to do
their
both?
hand. That's interesting, but okay. So, we talked about transformations, and it's easy when you're a CEO or a CTO and you come in and you go like, we are getting on the DevOps train, right? And everybody has to do it, or at least pretend they're doing it. But what do you do if you're like this little one person and people are like, but this is never gonna work here?
So I've been that person. I probably am that person, actually. Unlike these amazing people. So my title is a transformation lead, which actually doesn't mean a whole lot, and that's intentional. So the question here is it possible? We don't have all day. Is it possible to affect transformation from a position of limited authority? Yes, because to do transformation, it requires influence at every level of the organisation. So everybody that just raised their hand as an individual contributor, you influence somebody else that probably influences these guys. And I guess it's figuring out how you can communicate and also get a shared understanding with each other around what you're trying to achieve and the value from that. But it's 100% possible because I influence somebody in my organisation, but that often is influenced by a bunch of engineers who I probably understand 5 words of what they're saying, but I trust them. And I know that if they tell me something or raise a concern, that it's worth listening to. And that's just kind of like a domino effect, right, in an organisation. Because even our senior leaders, they don't know everything, even though some of them might try pretend they do.
I would agree that it is not only possible, but the most fun to affect change as an IC. And I also was thinking about what Nicole was saying about you have the broken record leadership kind of repeating, beating the drum, saying this is what we're going to do, but you need to uplift a team inside of the organization. Rebecca mentioned earlier, you have to almost have that one team that's doing the thing where everyone else is kind of looking over their shoulder saying, how do I get some of that? It starts the shoulder tapping. And I have found, these two things can work together. And actually, I think it's Gene Kim, who's one of my favorite people at talking about success through uplifting someone else. And this is a fun thing to do as an IC. So you can look at what can I do to improve the lives of someone else on my team, someone else in the organization. And as leaders, you can say, how can I take on the outside looking in, what might look like not the fun team to be on, the legacy team, the mainframe team, whatever it might be. How can I make them the cool kids? How can we uplift this team and say, they're going to affect change, and this is how we rally the rest of the organization around this initiative. So absolutely 100% can you do it from a position of limited authority. In some cases, the people in authority need that. That's how you get the results, I think.
Okay. So this is the part where we ask you to predict the future. So I hope you got your tarot cards and everything. What is your vision for the future of continuous delivery?
People actually do it.
Mic drop, yeah.
I think for me, it is continuing to expand the scope of applicability. More and more businesses are becoming technology companies, whether they like to admit it or not. And more applications that we haven't really seen before are coming online. Devices are proliferating. It's not that we don't know how to do any of those things individually, but I do think we have to expand the scope of where and how we apply the principles of continuous delivery to take into account more of the business changes that will continue to happen as a result of technology influencing greater and greater parts of different organizations. So to me, it's more of the same, but just, rather than thinking about it as within the context of the path to production, the way we think about it right now, that path to production is going to involve larger parts of the organization, and how do we extend the principles behind continuous delivery to apply in those situations?
So I'm going to kind of segue into this, and this is kind of the same question a little bit, but are we at the finish line? Like, have we arrived at continuous delivery for most people, or we're like
I don't think the race has started yet.
Okay.
We're still doing the trials.
Just a little bit. I mean, I agree, right? Like, we have so many things that we are still figuring out and starting. So I was a little very on brand and snarky with my answer, but we have a lot of things that we are still figuring out. So I do a bunch of work with like statistical analysis, and I know we had, like, there was a great talk yesterday on like machine learning and AI, but a bunch of things with statistical analysis. I was chatting with like Hillary Mason a couple months ago, and a bunch of this work involves doing an analysis and then having a stop decision point, and then doing more analysis and having a stop decision point. We haven't necessarily at all figure that out yet. Like right now, many times all we do is store the end state, right? So figuring that out, or figuring out how to handle audio work or visual work, right? Many times all we're doing is accounting for the end state, right? So figuring out how to handle decision points along the way of that journey, I think, is a really interesting challenge that I'm sure will be addressed. But right now, it's sort of like this external piece, like a really awful branch that we just like pull in at the very end.
The very last thing you said was what I was thinking about for the previous question and this one, which is so much of this is an afterthought. If I'm starting a new project today, I want to make my little widget do a thing, and then I want to put it somewhere where someone else can access that. And the first time I put it somewhere is not automated, right? And so that part always comes later. So, your answer to the previous question of, what do we want or what do we hope to see in the future is that we're actually doing it. And I would say, more ambitiously, or maybe it's the same thing that you were saying, is that we start there, right? A new project start there. Like, that is the default. The default isn't, I'm going to do this in some bespoke way, right? And I'm going to do this by hand, or, save that laborious work for later. Like, appreciating the value, you would always want to start there and say, I'm not going to do this by hand. This will waste so much time. I'm going to start here.
So it's CDDD, right?
Sure, yeah. I think that's right.
So this kind of gives me the next slide. What's the next big thing? Like the next, like, if we have arrived, and I think the answer is we haven't. But we kind of have, like, DevOps and continuous delivery became a big thing around the same time, and became this like widely used thing that people aspire to. But is there a next big thing coming after this?
So I was scared to answer the definitions question earlier. I'm still scared, but I'll say some words. If we think that my lame person's way of thinking about continuous delivery is it's the part of the pipe. I think one of the definitions we talked about it being like a pipeline. It's the part of this pipeline where the application is deployed to infrastructure which already exists, is a thing that I think about. And we, at one time in Sensu's life, before we were Sensu, were a consulting firm. We did a lot of automation consulting around configuration management and public cloud and whatnot, and built CD pipelines. But we had this, and maybe I'm saying things that everyone thinks is part of continuous delivery, so this is why it's scary. But if we had this vision that the automation would include the provisioning of the infrastructure that you would then deliver to, and Waterworld fans, dry land is not a myth. I've seen it. So this thing where you can, take a branch, make a change, and that branch doesn't have a place to be continuously deployed to yet. So we have all the automation to provision that infrastructure, deploy to it. Then when this branch gets merged and deleted, then we have the automation to go tear down that infrastructure, which we eventually deploy to. We had been thinking about this as continuous provisioning. I may be saying something now that is common practice. But in my experience, I see kind of that provisioning piece lives outside of the continuous delivery piece. And I think it's interesting to me if those become one and the same.
I'm going to talk around the question. So I guess over the last 3 questions is kind of the vision for it. Are we there yet? What are the next improvements? I'm going to take a selfish view here. Is I'm hoping that the next big improvement is actually more accessibility and a shared language, irrespective of whether you're in technology or in the business, a technical or non-technical. We actually all know what we're talking about and can actually start to collaborate with more diverse viewpoints, and that might actually get us on the journey to maybe starting or finishing, getting to the finish line of continuous delivery, irrespective of, I guess, our technical domain.
Okay. So, and kind of a lot of people alluded to this already, but continuous delivery is coming to more and more fields. I mean, in this conference, we intentionally tried to gather practitioners from different fields like ML and databases and security, which is still like kind of making its first steps into continuous delivery space. So what do you think, and if you have a favorite field, feel free to pick on it, but what do you think the trends are going to be for those different disciplines?
Well, I think one aspect of it is looking for how the principles underlying continuous delivery apply in these different contexts. And sometimes it's very easy to transfer the principles from one place to another, and sometimes you have to think about it a little more carefully. What does this principle actually mean? In the principles versus practices war, I'm always on the principles side because, to me, that's more general. And I can think about, okay, well, I'm trying to achieve this objective. How does that make sense in my context, in the legal department or in the marketing department, as opposed to, talking about specific practices. So I think as we continue to talk about what are the principles around automation and transparency and feedback and reliability and all of those things, the principles underlying continuous delivery, and then think, okay, well, what does that mean in the context of, managing a training data set and how I correlate the training set to whatever the model looks like at that particular point in time. What do those things mean in these different contexts? And so I think as we look at more fields and not just different technology implications, but business model implications, et cetera, what do those principles mean? So.
No more takers. So, like, one interesting one that came up more than once was infrastructure. So I don't know if anybody has opinions on that, because it's been much more continuously delivered, but it's also scary. So
I think this is what I was trying to say and not articulating very well, but we have you earlier, when Nicole, when not trying to, doing a very good job at defining continuous delivery, you said you kind of zoomed out and said you think about this as DevOps, and some part of that is what I've been a big believer in and advocate for is infrastructure as code, and we can look, there's generations of this happening, right? We have at one point that was your, what I call traditional configuration management, and you have public cloud APIs or some kind of compute API that you can talk to, and tools like Terraform and CloudFormation and whatnot, and you combine these things together and you can provision infrastructure in some kind of automated way. Now we are in a next generation of those tools with cloud native technologies and whatnot, and I think the marriage of all the automation and continuous delivery on the infrastructure side and what we're doing on the application side is what I was alluding to before. But I think we're seeing this happen. We've been seeing it happen for a long time in infrastructure, and that's part of that zoomed out, continuous delivery is part of this bigger picture that we talk about as DevOps. And please don't ask us to define DevOps. Yeah, I'll stop there.
So I'm going to move on. So this came up maybe like yesterday, and I thought it was an interesting question because, for Microsoft transformation has been a big deal. What do you think open source, was the role of open source in the future of continuous integration, continuous delivery?
Well, being a strong advocate of open source, period, of course I'm going to say it's a critical part of it. But I do think that when we look at any of the tooling that's involved, tools that support continuous delivery, continuous integration are so integrated into a company's stack that the advantages you have from a security perspective of having things in open source, having everybody being able to look at it, knowing exactly what's there. When you're talking about something that's so fundamental to being able to get and keep something running in production, I think open source is critical. It also, I think, allows people to understand concepts. If you're a developer and you hear something about continuous delivery, well, one of the ways you're probably going to try to figure out what that really means is you're going to look at the code of the tools that support it. And so it can help bring concepts to life through code. And so I think from both an education perspective and a security perspective, I think open source is critical.
I have thoughts. So we do see that, when we have run the data, we see that high and elite performers are more likely to be using open source in terms of platforms, components, functions, libraries, and plan to use more open source. So from that standpoint, many times from a security standpoint, it's much better, right? Because more people have looked at it, more people have hacked at it, more people have had an opportunity to fix the hacks that they found. From some ways, from a risk standpoint, it's much better. Risk in terms of backfill of people, right? From a recruiting standpoint, it's better, right? If someone decides they want a job somewhere else, it's much easier to find people versus closed source or fully proprietary software, right? There are several very large enterprises that have developed their very own languages. It's incredibly risky to continue to develop on those languages because your pool is very difficult. From a supportability and documentation standpoint, it's much better because Heidi, what's up? Where's Heidi? Everyone, I love you, but everyone hates documentation. No one documents their code, but you have a much greater likelihood of finding any kind of documentation for an open source project because at least you've got the world helping you out versus a fully internal proprietary software stack. So that there's a litany of pros to open source. However, it's not all roses. Oh, and people are going to say there's no lock-in. F yourself, there's totally lock-in. Google's gonna hate me right now.
It's also usually not free, right?
It's so. Can I finish real quick? Sorry. Yeah, it's not free, right? Like it's still a puppy, and there's still switching costs. If you're all open source and you want to change technologies, that's still a cost. It's still lock-in. You've just locked into a different tool. Also, there are very, very real costs for choosing an open source platform that you may not know is supported by one person. Also, we really need to figure out what we're doing when enterprises are leveraging an open source platform for which they are not paying. I'm real mad about that, right? Can we please start paying, especially like communities and hobbyists, and what are, like, we've been spouting I'm totally on can I stand on a box somewhere? We keep spouting the value, which is very true, that it's much better and more stable and more secure to be developing and delivering software with speed and stability. There are going to be implications for leveraging and relying on software that is developed by communities, and I say this with love, communities of people who have varying levels and degrees of time and availability and background, which is great. Like, this is fantastic. Also, we tend to be very hostile to these people. So, like, we need to find ways to compensate them and thank them and be less hostile to them. And, okay, I'm done now.
So, thank you. As a CEO of a company that develops open source software, I'm very grateful for these words. And I would say a couple things, at least 3 things here. I think open source is one of the ways that we stand on the shoulders of giants. It's how we continue to improve as a community, as a group of practitioners. I think Brooke mentioned earlier about having a shared language. And so open source tends to be the way we get towards a shared language, even if it's not a single platform, if it's at least an interface, right? So this is the interface between these different parts of our organization. You can't get there without open source, I believe. Adam Jacob once said, I'm gonna try and remember the exact quote, that mission critical infrastructure systems must be open source to achieve true scale. And scale doesn't have to be in terms of how large an individual organization can be. It can be the adoption across our industry. And
What's COBOL? It's mission critical. It's massive.
Okay, so I'm going to jump in here. Sorry, clearly we need to continue this discussion.
We'll sidebar that one.
But so we only have a couple minutes left, so I want to finish. I'm going to give you a pick of one of 2 questions. So one is, what is the one thing that everyone can do when they go back to work tomorrow and to improve their organization? And the other, what is the biggest thing you've learned since you started your journey that you wish you knew, right, that you can share?
The one thing everyone can do to improve their organization, be kind to someone. And give someone a voice who is currently underrepresented.
Figure out something that's broken and figure out what you can do to fix it.
One thing that everyone can do is go talk to somebody that's in a different discipline to you and understand what they care about and what their priorities are, and think about what you could do to help them.
I'm not even going to try to add, just to ask for a round of applause for those excellent answers.
All right, well, we are at time. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for coming. We super appreciate the level of expertise on this stage. And of course, we have different spaces for discussions. And so if you have any questions and you want to take pictures for posterity, find these folks later. And there's a break right now.